Tonight we will have what I think is going to be a fascinating program featuring Andrew Hoehn, the Vice President of the RAND Corporation, the great think tank, and Thom Shanker, a former New York Times Pentagon correspondent. Their new book, which we will have on sale afterwards, by the way, is a sobering look at this scary world we're in. It is also, in the words of former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, a panoramic view of American defense. In this book, Age of Danger, they contend that after 30 plus years of relative peace in the what was known as the post-Cold War period, we're now in an age of danger. The threats are from China, Russia, germ warfare, cyber attacks, drones, and then there's climate change. Note what's missing from the list: terrorism. There's been too much focus on that, they contend, and all of it, and then in the midst of all that focus, all these other threats have developed. Thom summed it up in an interview with the Atlantic Council. He said, "We responded to 9/11, but we put China on the back burner." I asked them tonight to focus on China, which is their main and first chapter. Henry Kissinger, at his 100th anniversary and 100th birthday interview with The Economist, explained why. He said, quote, "We are on a path to great power confrontation. Both sides have convinced themselves that the other represents a strategic danger." Andrew and Thom will also give us a sampling of some of the other strategic dangers we're facing. Andrew is the Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis at the RAND Corporation. He's responsible for all US-based research and analysis, quality assurance and recruitment, and oversight of RAND's 1,500 staff. It sounds like you're running RAND, frankly. Previously, he was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, where he was responsible for developing and implementing U.S. defense strategy, force planning and assessments, and long-range policy planning. He's spent altogether 19 years at RAND, 15 years at the Department of Defense. Before joining government, he was an associate editor, however, of the Marine Corps Gazette. So he has a journalistic side as well. He got his MA in Public and International Affairs from the University of Pittsburgh and a BA in Political Science from Baldwin Wallace College. Thom Shanker is a senior fellow now at the Atlantic Council's Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. He is also the director of the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University. Prior to that, he was a reporter and editor for nearly 25 years at the New York Times. This included 13 years covering the Pentagon. His final editing post was deputy editor for Diplomacy, Military, and Veterans Affairs. Before he joined the Times, he had a huge career with the Chicago Tribune. He was foreign editor there, among other things. He was European correspondent for 5 years. He was Moscow correspondent for 6 years. He reported the opening, altogether he was in journalism for 40 years. Very productive years, let me tell you. He reported the opening series of Balkan Wars, which is where I got to know him, but he just reminded me that we got to know each other in Moscow before that. And he did groundbreaking reporting on systematic rape in Bosnia. He is also the co-author of a New York Times bestseller on the U.S. fight against al-Qaeda. He has an MA from the Fletcher School, a BA from Colorado College. So to the question for the night. Can the slide into great power competition with China be stopped short of war? Thom and Andrew, the floor is yours.
Roy, thank you very much for that very generous introduction. When I hear that, it just makes me feel old. But it's a great honor for Andy and for me to be here with the Baltimore Council on Foreign Affairs. We so appreciate all of you coming out. Speaking to many of you, you have military service and government service, and we thank you so much for all you've done in many ways to keep our country safe for so very, very long. I do need to give a special thanks to Roy, and I'm sure I will completely embarrass him. But as he said, we first met during the Cold War meeting on covering stories in Central Europe. We spent a lot of time together on the ground in the Balkans during the wars in the former Yugoslavia. As you probably know, Roy won a Pulitzer Prize for his coverage there, which is journalism's highest honor. It's so great that he's working with this organization now. It's really not an understatement to say that Roy Gutman redefined combat and conflict journalism as we know it today. Having spent much of my adult life covering frontline conflict in the Balkans, Central America, Central Asia, and of course Iraq and Afghanistan, there is a natural journalistic tendency to follow the sound of gunfire. And that is not an illegitimate story. I mean, the changing of turf in Ukraine helps us understand the war. But what Roy did as just groundbreaking work was to elevate the human story, focusing on war crimes and war, and not just on the war itself. He elevated studies in international humanitarian law. I mean, if journalists don't have copies of the Geneva Convention in their pocket when they go off to war, bad on them. And if they do, it's a tribute to Roy's work. He really has, again, redefined the way American journalism covers conflict and for the better. So Roy, thank you for that very, very much. Roy did a nice job setting the stage for our talk this evening. I'll give a little more fundamentals, platform work, but Andy and I, we'll speak for a bit, but we really do hope this will be a conversation because all of you have expertise and ideas, and we look for a discussion that really allows us to talk about that. As Roy said, Andy entered the Pentagon as the Cold War was winding down. He worked on NATO enlargement, and he left shortly after the invasion of Iraq. Been at RAND ever since. When we first met, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy, which is a title that basically translates into English as very smart guy. I joke that Andy's the brains of the operation. My career, Moscow, Balkans, I'm a Cold War kid. I have the NATO gene. And, partly it's been my trying to understand how things changed, because I was very much a part of the public narrative after 9/11 that put terrorism front and center. I mean, Andy was in his office at the Pentagon on 9/11. I was on the D6 bus from my home in the Palisades, transferring to the Farragut North Blue Line station to go to my desk at the Pentagon on 9/11. And basically, it defined what we all did for 20 years. And Andy and my basic finding is that we overly defined national security as terrorism for far too long. Starting about 5 years ago, Andy and I were continuing a series of conversations, and we could see bigger and bigger problems were emerging. Not just the failed terror wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, but a lack of preparedness for a host of emerging threats. We were losing key technology, the edge, in things like drones that were a monopoly, satellites, which were our monopoly, and we were unprepared for a global pandemic. I mean, any death above zero is a tragedy, but let's not forget that on 9/11, 3,000 people died, and we launched 2 forever wars. COVID has claimed 1 million American lives, still counting. We never went on a war footing. There was never any national political agreement on where COVID came from and how we should deal with it as a united nation, as a country, marching together. And we think part of it was this overemphasis on the very narrow threat of terrorism. So Andy and I began buying dinners for just about anybody who would sit with us at this wonderful Lebanese restaurant near the Pentagon. We sat with generals and admirals and captains and colonels, people from the intelligence community who sat with us, made us put our notebooks away, but shared their thoughts with us. We talked to people in the private sector, AI experts, and we just began soaking in everything they were saying. And our first goal was to write a book about all the ticking time bombs for which this country was unprepared. But guess what? That book would go on forever. And so we started thinking, well, what is a smarter way for us to assess a series of national security threats come up for comprehensive answers to deal with them, such that whether the problems we outline in our book are the threats, or threats for which we can't even name yet, but we will have tools in place to deal with them. And so that's our bottom line, to move the definition of national security from a Zoom-like focus on counterterrorism that monopolized this country for more than 20 years to a more comprehensive definition. Leave the strategic cul-de-sac of the Middle East and look around the world, around the corner, over the horizon, at the threat of climate change, risks to our health, risks to our food sources. I was out in Des Moines, Iowa last week. Believe me, they are afraid of a blight that would make an agricultural blight that would make COVID look like a bad cold. You could wipe out the entire global wheat crop in a year if some of the things they are experimenting with and concerned with come about. So that's why we rightly call our book Age of Danger, because we believe we've never faced this many threats, accelerating faster, coming at us from all sides, ever before. And of course, primary among them are our question from Roy tonight, which is great power competition, starting with China. With that, I'll ask my partner and friend, Andy Hoehn, to take over.
Thom, thank you so much for that. Roy, thank you for the terrific invitation. What a pleasure to be here. To the leadership of the council and to the members, this is a real honor for us. And it's exactly the kind of conversation that Thom and I were so looking forward to having when we wrote this book. I'm going to pick up on the China story, and you're going to have to indulge me a bit. I've lived much of this story. I'm an insider to this story, and so I will take you through some of what's unfolded here. I want to begin in a way by pointing out there are several China stories to tell. We're going to spend a little bit more time on the national security focus, but let's not forget about the China story that involves business. For a long time, really since 1979, but certainly beginning in the early to mid 90s, and certainly by the late 90s when China enters the World Trade Organization, China's thought of a place where we can do business. And that theme is running strongly through policy. We can feel it in various elements of how the policy world's responding, how we're interacting with the leadership in China, and how the leadership in this country is positioning to accept China into this larger community. That's one thread. There's another thread, though, of China as a potential security risk, of a growing set of military capabilities, and that's the part I've lived. Let me run into that a little bit deeper. Thom and I were on a really interesting quest, which is, where does the China story in the national security community begin? We're not talking about millennia, we're not talking about thousands of years ago, but where does the contemporary story begin? We think we know the answer. There was a short or a medium-sized paper written by a Pentagon insider, a fellow named Andrew Marshall, often known as the Yoda of the Pentagon. He ran an office called the Net Assessment, was hired, in fact, by Henry Kissinger to form that office initially on the National Security Council staff in about 1970 or 71, moves to the Pentagon. He's the person who's responsible for really thinking about the future, looking around corners, understanding what's coming. He partners with an economist from the Rand Corporation in the mid-'80s, in fact, February 1985, and they write a paper in which they project China's economy will surpass the Soviet economy by 2010. Now, they're not projecting the end of the Soviet Union, but they are seeing how China's new economy, in which it's entering the world, is gaining steam. And that's when they say this is going to generate surplus. There's going to be resources. China's going to want to protect its position in the world. It is going to build a military that's going to be competitive in the world. 1985. Now, interestingly, we had a chance to speak to Andy Marshall a few months before he passed away at age 97. lived a very long, very, a life in which he was contributing right to the end. And he pointed out to us, 1985 is the middle of the Reagan defense buildup. He's working for Fred Clay, who's the Undersecretary for Policy in the Pentagon at the time. And Clay says to him, you guys have got to cool it. We're in the midst of, trying to respond to a Soviet threat. You're now taking us in a different direction. We, really enjoy your paper. We've got other things to do for now. You're going to hear that story over and over. We got other things to do for now. Marshall doesn't let go of it. By the early 90s, he and his team are looking at what might a China with a growing economy that's now growing at, 5-6% a year, what might it do with this surplus it's generating? What might its military look like? They're running war games in the early 90s in which they're saying this country in 15, 20, 25 years could compete rather effectively with the United States. Not a lot of people are paying attention to that in the early 90s, but by the late 90s, more and more people are paying attention to that. By 2000, 2001, a lot of people are paying attention to that. I happened to be running the strategy review in the Defense Department in 2001 when the Bush administration arrived, and a big theme of that review until September 10th of 2001 was to prepare for China's emergence as a military power. Let me pick up one other theme here. You recall in 1995 or 96, some of you may remember, China was flexing some of its early muscle, fired some missiles on either side of Taiwan. Secretary William Perry, Bill Perry, was Secretary of Defense at the time. He's an old artilleryman. He said, I know what this is. They're simply bracketing a target. You fire to the left, you fire to the right, you can certainly hit the middle. The United States responds to that by dispatching 2 aircraft carriers, sends one through the strait. The second one never even really doesn't have to arrive. And China's military backs down. Backs down in the sense that this is no competition for the United States at the moment. But there's a decision taken in the Chinese Communist Party that this is not going to happen to us again. We're not going to be humiliated on a global stage by having exercised use of coercive force, that is to threaten a neighbor, and have the United States come from half a world away and have us stand down. That's when the modern Chinese military modernization really begins in the mid-90s. But then, of course, 2001 arrives. We know we had to respond to that. Thom, I think, gives a very good overarching narrative, which is there was every expectation that we had to find and the perpetrators of this. There was going to be, Afghanistan was either going to yield bin Laden and Al-Qaeda, or we were going to go to war there. We didn't have to go to war in Iraq, but we'll leave that as a different discussion. But we then find ourselves in this moment in which terrorism becomes the Zoom, or to borrow from the line that Victor Hugo once, telescope or microscope. We chose to use the microscope, and the microscope was about terrorism. There was no expectation as the head of strategy in 2001 that would be the preoccupation of this country for the next 20 years, but it was. And that's how it played out. So let me take this China story forward a little bit more. By the early, I mentioned as the head of the strategy, as the leader of the strategy review, preparing for China was a big emphasis in that review. But 9/11 comes along, we have to respond to that. And by most estimates, the intelligence estimates at the time said China's military modernization really isn't going to come to fruition for about 20 years, 2020, let's say. So time is on our side in a way. In fact, that's what we say in this book, time's on our side. Except that time is moving along. What we do see is by about middle of 2008, 2010, the American military becomes increasingly concerned. They're now undertaking, this is in Andy Marshall's little think tank in the Pentagon, they're now running their own war games. And their own war games are saying, the way we think about fighting wars the way we would protect Taiwan should it come under attack, it isn't going to work anymore. It just isn't going to work. Think of how the American military has deployed when you think about, over the last few decades. We send large numbers of troops right to the periphery of the fighting area. We move all of our jets right to the edge of the fighting area, our land troops and so forth. Well, China's figured out, if this is an operation that involves Taiwan or the surrounding areas, there aren't that many areas in which you could locate your aircraft or your troops. They build a very large missile force. They could bring that under attack. And the idea that we could reinforce or send large numbers and then conduct operations is just something that would lead to failure. The shorthand for what this is described is anti-access aerial denial. If you're in among military folks, they'll say A2AD, anti-access area denial. What it really means is China's devised a way to create a large keep-out zone. Now, all the while people are working about this, thinking about this, but remember, we're in the Middle East, and there have been attempts at different times. In 2012, then President Obama announces an intent, it's actually in 2010, but it culminates near 2012, announces an intention to pivot to Asia. Again, this is in response to China's growing influence, its potential, its realization about its military modernization and so forth. But the Middle East keeps calling. And so not soon after that announcement, both there's a budget crisis here in the United States, but then ISIS is reemerging in Iraq, and Obama has to commit troops back into Iraq. I'm going to take you to the end of the story fairly quickly here, but it's in the course of the last decade, this awareness of China's military modernization, what it means, is really seized the leadership in the Pentagon. You're going to read in our book a story about a senior Air Force general that we talked to. It was a really wonderful conversation. And we were asking him, so what are you learning? And he said, what we're learning is we're running war game after war game, and we're simply losing faster. Frightening. But then we said, what about the ideas? He said, oh, there are ideas, and we know them, and we tell the story of some very interesting ideas. I don't want to leave you with the idea that nobody is thinking about how to solve this. There's some really terrific ones. But the slowness of the system is getting in our way. So we tell the story of a physicist who's partnered with this general. They're thinking about how you could use sensors in new ways, and we can perhaps go into some of that in the question and answer period. There are good ideas out there. But in some sense, part of the danger we're seeing is the slowness in our own system. We're now out of the Middle East. We have an opportunity. The question, is there a way that we could perhaps forestall the crisis that Roy talks about? We like to think about the way to forestall the crisis is to have an effective deterrent. And an effective deterrent is really established in a way in which either of the party realizes there's a real prospect of failure. And so when we think about defense planning and what we should be doing, the kind of support we would provide to our partners in East Asia, to our partners elsewhere, Tom's going to talk to Russia in a moment, we want to think about how do we present serious options that could lead to the real prospect for failure among those that would challenge their neighbors. Those ideas are out there. We just have to get the system moving. We have to get it moving in a way. So I began the story by saying the two paths in which there was the idea that we can do business in China, but then there's this national security community saying there is serious risk with China in the military modernization that's embarked upon. I'll leave you with one last idea. Those paths have converged a lot, and they've really converged since about 2012. And again, we tell the story in the book of meeting with the National Security Council staff, and they would talk about how business leaders would show up at the White House and say, cool it on this China talk. We don't need to be escalating tensions. We do have serious things that we can be doing there. And the national security community is saying, we have to become ready in a way because they see these dangers mounting. What we saw were those paths converging, and it really came when Xi became the leader of the Communist Party. And of course, we know just in the last few months, now his third 5-year term as leader of the Communist Party. His emphasis on built in China 2025, his emphasis that this was not going to be a friendly place to do business, brought about some really interesting changes in the U.S. business community. I won't say those paths have completely merged, but they're merging. And there really is more of a common view now. How do we live up to these challenges? That's part of the danger that we're confronting. So why don't I pause that story for now, Tom? We can come back to it in question and answer. I know you've got a little bit you want to say about Russia.
Yeah, thanks. We would certainly want to leave time for Q&A, but one of the reasons Andy and I call this an age of danger, and if you talk to senior generals at the Pentagon, they will say that never in American history have we faced two adversaries at the same time posing existential threats. Andy's given you our A to Z on China. I want to spend just a couple of quick minutes talking about the other one, which of course is Russia. We call Putin the threat that was hiding in plain sight because he's always surprising us, but guess what? He's already told us out loud and for years what he planned to do. I was at Munich in 2007 for the security conference when Putin gave this incredible speech talking about how the U.S. was becoming a hyperpower, and he was going to do everything he could to redraw the traditional Russian near abroad, including Georgia and Ukraine. Not as a new communist global power, but more as a new czar with hegemony over the areas around it. A year after that speech, he invaded Georgia, caught us by surprise. 2014, the first invasion of Ukraine, Crimea, caught us by surprise. Andy and I talked to the 4-star general who was in charge of NATO in 2014 when Russian forces first went into Ukraine, foreshadowing what happened a year ago. He told us he had 0 tactical warning. 0. Nobody saw it coming. He said he was so angry, he went off like a well-hit 9-iron in a tile bathroom, an image that I just love. So he flew to Washington to ask what happened. And what he was told is that on the day before the Berlin Wall fell, there were about 15,000 U.S. analysts watching the Soviet Union. On the day before the first invasion of Ukraine in 2014, that 15,000 analysts had dropped to about 1,000 watching Russia. On the day before the Berlin Wall fell, 50% of the intelligence budget was focused on the Soviet Union. 2014, the day before the first invasion of Ukraine, that had shrunk to 15%. We willfully blinded ourselves to this threat. And as we saw last year with the invasion of Ukraine a second time, Putin always does what he says. My final thought is people often ask me, are we in a new Cold War with Russia? Friends, Russia is already at war with us. Make no mistake about it. Election meddling, that sounds like regime change to me. Disinformation, invading sovereign countries. I love our democracy because our default is peace. Going to war is hard, and we love that about the United States. Putin, not that way. He has a rheostat. He can go from cold to warm to hot and back again. And Andy described how China went to school on how we fight wars. We have not gone to school on how Putin has a rheostat for war. And until we do, he's going to keep surprising us, and it's going to be a real age of danger. Now, Andy, for any final thoughts?
Just a couple of things here, Tom. So I've spent quite a bit of time on China. Tom, a few minutes on Russia. When you have a chance to read the book, you'll see that those are two very important anchor points. But when we talk about dangers, we're also talking about threats of pandemic disease or threats to food security. We have a section on cyber-related matters and, very importantly, artificial intelligence, which is very topical right now. Climate is a focus for us. Drones. And so you say, boy, this compiling of problems, how do we deal with that? You know, there was a genius that emerged at the end of World War II that built the modern national security system. It's represented in the 1947 National Security Act. That creates the Department of Defense, creates the modern Air Force, the CIA, the National Security Council. We think of as an advisor to the president. That doesn't exist. It emerges in some ways, some advice to the president during World War II. Certainly doesn't exist before then. And what we're calling for in this book is to relook at that. It was 1947 when that act was established. It served us well. We call it in a way the 47 Chevy. It was shiny and new and beautiful. It's dented and rusted, and it's got it's burning oil. We had a reader of the book that a former deputy national security advisor wrote us back and sent a really note and said, maybe it's time to put the 47 Chevy in the garage. We need to build the modern system. Now, Thom and I aren't ones to jump in and say, let's spend more money. We may need to spend more money, but the first answer, let's spend the money we've committed. Let's spend it wisely. By our count, $1 trillion to $1.25 trillion a year, $1 trillion to $1.25 trillion a year spent on national security in this country. That is an enormous sum of funds. Let's make sure we spend that wisely before we're committing more. So how to do that? The military's figured some of this out fairly well. Through some of its own problems over the years, it's learned to build joint capabilities. Well, joint task forces is how the military likes to think. This is how the Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard, this is how they come together. When we think about some of the problems that we're looking at, the China problem, although I focused a lot on the military dimension, this is going to be an economic challenge as much as a military one. We're going to have to find ways in which the Commerce Department and the Treasury and other actors are going to be, playing the roles of the Joint Chiefs that the Joint Chiefs did in the old system. We're going to have to fuse that together. When we think about public health preparedness, when we talk to the experts in the field, you hear them describe something that sounds like military readiness, not going on from moments of feast, that is influx of resources, to famine in which there's no money around, but having a ready force, building that at national, state, local levels, having international relationships and so forth. We had a terrific conversation with General Stan McChrystal. Some of you may remember him. He really made a name for himself in Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq, he was using intelligence and action away, using the modern special forces. He said he inherited what really was a silver bullet, but he was learned to turn that into action, to have a real action-oriented system. And he built that by having trained forces, ready forces, and he had a motto in which he called it eyes on. That is, the commander's job is to know what's happening out there, but hands off. Don't have your hands on everything. Let that system run. We're talking about building systems to deal with these problems that resemble something of that. Having the horizontal pieces across the verticals. We're not calling for new cabinet departments reporting to the president, but building the connective tissue across the pieces that do exist. That would require some reallocation of resources. We would do that before we'd come with the influx of new funding. So just in summary, we've highlighted a bit of our focus on China. I apologize as an insider. I enjoy talking about that, partly because I've lived so much of it. Thom, who began his career reporting from Moscow, focused some on Russia. There's a lot of other pieces here that we can talk about. So I think we're going to pause here, and we really look forward to your questions and to be part of this larger conversation. Roy, thank you.
But one question in passing is that you are basically suggesting that deterrence is the best way to avoid a clash with China. But the point that Henry Kissinger made is that the Chinese see us as a strategic threat, and we seem to see the Chinese as a strategic threat. Is there any way other than deterrence, which is sounds like a military buildup, to convince them that we're not, and for us to convince ourselves that they are not.
Roy, I'm glad you raised that, and I don't want to cast this too narrowly. So when we look at problems like climate, energy transitions, supply chain matters, migration across areas, and so forth, we're going to have to cooperate with China. I think we need to, we want to, we should seek that out. The fact that Secretary of State Blinken is seeking to meet with his counterpart in the leadership in China, to me, is a very good sign. The very proximate issue of Taiwan, though, remains a worrisome one. And that's where was highlighting the importance of deterrence. And let me add a specific definition to that: the real prospect of failure. We're not there to control territory. We're not there to advocate for independence from Taiwan. We made very clear in our One China policy as a country what our position is. We simply don't want a unification of China and Taiwan by force. And the way to avoid that is for the Communist Party leadership to understand there is a real prospect for failure. That's what the focus of the security planning ought to be. In terms of the larger relationship, it ought to be cooperative in a variety of ways. One of the very smart people that Tom and I talked to as we were working on finishing the book is a fellow with the Council on Foreign Relations. Paul Stars is his name. And Paul reminded us that it was the early part of the Cold War that we resolved some of the nuclear contests through this idea of mutual assured destruction. The idea that no party could think they would win a nuclear war. And therefore, that was really the basis for allowing other things to for allowing cooperative actions to happen in various ways. Mutual assured destruction allowed for survival. What Paul was calling for, and which we have a certain attraction to, the name certainly, but the ideas behind it, is we need to build ideas of mutual assured survival. And that's going to take that kind of cooperation that you're talking about, Roy, when we think about the larger relationship. So deterrence for certain when it regards the issue of Taiwan. The larger relationship is going to have to be built on some elements of trust and cooperation where we can find it.
In lieu of our previous administration and the appearance that President Trump gave in support of Russia, and then he took that to another level of gaining camaraderie among at least a third of the American population. And so they looked through the eyes of Trump as this partnership with Russia. Now, if I heard you correctly, you said that Russia and China together are our biggest threats in this age. Now, how can we educate the American population that is so caught up with Trump that even if he said that Putin is our friend, they yield to it, which would cause...
No, it's okay. Please, sir. Please continue.
Which will cause the population to be splintered. Because I'm sure just by that comment, because I'm a different person, just by that comment, you could see the splinter. Because if he says that Russia is my friend, and yet with your expertise, you are saying that they are the major threat, how do you handle that within the American population?
Yeah, it's a great question. Thank you. And believe it or not, even though I am decidedly apolitical and nonpartisan, I actually welcome the question. So thank you. First of all, just to be clear at the technical level, Russia and China are our largest nation state threats. I actually think climate change is the real existential threat that we are not dealing with successfully. That's for another conversation. But to your very good question, sir, Andy wrote a line in our conclusion that I've complimented in almost every time we've been in public because it just spoke to me in ways I hadn't thought, because we would write chapters individually and then swap them for editing. Worked out really, really well. I'll just say that the only thing that Andy and I disagreed on over 5 years of writing this book is I like kayaking and he likes canoeing. But other than that, we agreed on just about everything. To your very important question, Andy wrote a line that said, we write about the national security machine. Let's never forget the machine is people. And there's never been a more important time in our nation's history. Every presidential election is important, but we really have to get the right people in the jobs at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. And I'm not here to tell you how to vote. I'm not going to advocate for a party or a candidate. But let me assure you, Andy and I have been on the front lines of national security for 40 years each. This country is not safe when we are divided. This country is not safe when bankruptcy is a political tool for our entire government. So again, I welcome your question. Please don't expect me to speak to candidates' names, because that doesn't matter. But each of us needs to look in our hearts and choose people for office who put America, our entire nation, as the priority. And we have a long history of bipartisan foreign policy that saw this country through war and conflict and risk. And Andy and I advocate a return to that thoughtful, bipartisan, not partisan, bipartisan foreign policy. So thank you for your question.
The first question is, you had said that the United States has never faced nation-state adversaries, two existential threats at the same time. But wouldn't you say that we did that in 1942?
They could not destroy our way of life. They didn't have nuclear weapons.
Okay.
Andy's putting,
Fair enough.
they could not have, like an existential threat destroying our existence.
Okay.
We did not have that risk in World War II. We have two powers now that could do that.
Okay.
Never before.
Okay, so that's the hinge, is nuclear weapons. Okay, so the second question is, the plan was in the early to mid-1990s, during the Deng Xiaoping era, that the United States was going to engage China in the marketplace, integrate businesses, have them become a market for our goods, have them be a supplier for our markets. Is there anything that we could have done differently then that would not have led us to where we are now? Or did it not matter?
I think there are a number of things we could have done. I want to call out one specifically. We should have done a much, much better job of protecting our own intellectual property. So Thom often tells the story of, when we think about cyber-related challenges, and there was this discussion of a potential cyber Pearl Harbor, could that happen? A lights-out scenario. And in our work and in following the policy community, the thing that really happened was perhaps the largest single theft in world history, and that is the hundreds of billions of dollars a year of intellectual property that left this country that was being taken by China. That's where I think we should have really focused early on in this competition and might have made a much bigger difference. We could talk about other areas that might have made this go better, or others that might have made it worse. But I think it was that theft of intellectual property and the realization in the business community that that wasn't being fixed that changed the business community. And so we could go on a longer conversation, but that would be the one factor I'd point to in particular.
I want to touch on the topic of economics quickly, and the potential danger of economic warfare, given that China controls quite a bit of our national debt, and with all of the discussions and negotiations that will only go higher, I can presume. So what are your thoughts on the danger of economic warfare when China calls in all of their loans, and how do we mitigate that possibility?
I work with a lot of economists at the RAND Corporation, And it's one of the fascinating things of my job. And they're much less worried about China's purchase of our debt, that is through treasury bills and so forth. And they're much more worried about their own debt, China's own debt. It's overinvested in real estate. So much so, the numbers will be off by a little bit, but real estate and investment in this country is single digits of GDP. It's about 30% of China's gross domestic product investment in real estate. They've overbuilt an infrastructure for a population that's going to be shrinking rather dramatically. They're a lot more worried about China's management of its own debt than their holding of American debt. And they point to that as a huge systemic risk, that how that China's leadership would deal with it. Of course, the Bank of China would intervene wherever possible to preclude any kind of economic crisis in China. But we've seen moments of default already. We just saw it in the past year, a very large scale, and that could have a cascading effect. And so I think, in a way, the concern is recognized that you raised, but the people that are looking at real systemic risk are looking at China's own debt. I think we want to follow that story to where it might lead in terms of the potential real concern here.
Thank you.
A major theme of what you're talking about seems to be a pattern of being unprepared for thing after thing after thing. How much of it is because most of our politicians and the American public are ignorant of recurring historic patterns, so they don't see them coming? How much is it because private interest displaced the public interest, and how much because we've made DARPA risk adverse and anything else we can mention?
That actually was one of the starting points, sir, of our entire research. So that is like a foundational question. I'll take a first crack at it. I'm sure Andy will as well. What's interesting on 9/11, there are people who said, oh my gosh, Al-Qaeda, who? Well, I assure you there were people in government who knew everything about Osama bin Laden and had spent their entire careers tracking Al-Qaeda. So when people say, why didn't the government know? Why didn't the government warn us? Well, there usually are people who know and know very well and care deeply about these things. But why isn't their warning listened to? And that's one of the things that we address in our book. And there are several reasons. The intelligence community, if you ever read, there's so much unclassified national intelligence estimates. You should just read one time as an education. They're very thoughtful, they're very thorough, but they're often caveated in ways that sound an uncertain trumpet. I've read the NIE on Bosnia, where Roy and I spent several years. Came out in 92 before the war really got bad, 91, 92. It predicted with absolute certainty what would happen, including the level of horrific violence. But it also said, maybe it won't happen. And so the Clinton administration, who had no interest in getting involved, read that paragraph. Same with ISIS. President Obama dismissed ISIS as the junior varsity of terror. Andy and I interviewed generals and intelligence people who were screaming like crazy about ISIS, but there wasn't a political will. So you have to warn efficiently, you have to warn with confidence, the warning has to be heard properly, there has to be the political will, and as Andy makes the point, there has to be apparatus to act on that warning. And we are advocating through creation of a series of standing joint task forces that will practice 4 times a year so there is an apparatus in place. Think about Operation Warp Speed. What a blessing there was a vaccine in 1 year. How much better if we'd been practicing on pandemics for the past 10? We might have had a vaccine in 90 days. There was no institution to act on it. So wonderful question, thank you.
I do want to say a little bit more about it. Having been part of the national security institution for much of my career, ignorance isn't really an issue that I would highlight. I think people are aware. Tom's really focused on much of the here and now. Another theme you're going to see when you read this book is the idea of how much the here and now dominates. And we really advocate for the idea that the future has to have a seat at the table. When we talk to former national security advisors, they all recognize that that inbox is crowded and constant. The demands are unrelenting on the leadership. Make no mistake that every day is a busy day, and some days are horrendously busy days for anyone in a leadership position. Keep building the right institutional mechanisms so that the future has a legitimate voice. The problems that are coming can compete with the here and now. That's part of the way to the answer to this. And, talking to the people that have held those positions, they really advocate for just that. Give the future a seat at the table if you want to have some of these problems get real recognition.
Conspiracy theories. You mentioned the possibility of germ warfare being a key weapon of war. Was COVID the first shot fired in that in a deliberate way? And the second question is, you speak of Russia and China being key threats to the U.S. Talk, if you would, about the dynamics between Russia and China, and does Ukraine's potential victory, or at least fighting to a stalemate, change that dynamic?
On the first question, I don't know. I follow the same information that you read. I just don't know the answer to that. What I do know is that the people that understand the most about the potential for artificial intelligence are very worried about the idea of germ warfare. That through the use of artificial intelligence, that you could create germs of various types, and I think I won't go very far into this discussion, but that you could create a virus that maybe targets a certain kind of a population, not the entire population, and that could be under the control of a party or parties. People really worry about it. These are serious people that are worried about that. In terms of the Russia-China relationship, I'm going to ask Thom to say more about it. I think there is a tension that's always going to exist in this. My understanding of Russia over time is it does not intend to be junior partner to anyone. And I don't see this being a successful partnership if it's one in which Russia is going to be the junior partner to China. And I don't have any confidence that China is looking for an equal partner. So I think this is going to be a relationship of convenience more than anything. And I would expect there to be a lot of tensions in it.
Relative to, and then looking at Russia, Ukraine, China, Taiwan. So the first question really revolves around, have the Chinese learned anything from Russia that they would apply in the war on Ukraine? And the second part is, the impression is that we're focusing a lot more on China taking over Taiwan in relative size and relative approximately in time, relative to Ukraine taken over by Russia. Could this be seen through the eyes of China as our interest being more Eastern-based and not Western-based, and therefore provide them with a more reason to be strengthened and confident in their proposal to be the new economic power?
I think China's learning a lot from watching Russia in Ukraine. Mostly it's what not to do. I was in Moscow during the entire Cold War. I remember, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the Russian soldiers are 10 feet tall and their weapons are invincible. But if you live there, this was a country that couldn't pave the streets around the Kremlin and couldn't provide fresh fruit to its population year round. I mean, what kind of a superpower is that? I always hate quoting Clausewitz because it sounds so pretentious, but bear with me. Clausewitz talks about national power as being both the blade of the sword and the hilt. The blade is the weapons and the hilt is the people. And the Soviet Union and Russia today has a very corrupt hilt And that's why they're struggling so much in Ukraine. I think China is learning some important lessons. Say what you will about the forever wars after 9/11, but the United States has the blessing, wrong word, has the value of an extremely experienced military. China hasn't fought a war in decades. And I know that worries its leaders because everybody thought that Russia and Putin's modernization, they were going to roll into Kyiv in 6 hours. Didn't happen because the Ukrainians are spirited. They have a strong handle as well as the blade provided by NATO. Guess what else? China has clients, not allies. The U.S. has allies. And again, I don't want to get partisan, but I think it is a fact to say that the previous president undermined our alliance with NATO, which was tended to by the new administration. We could not be rearming Ukraine today without a strong NATO alliance. And even though we don't have a NATO in Asia, I think China looks at our relationship with Australia and New Zealand and the Philippines and Japan with incredible envy. Now, the benefit that China does have is there's no Poland next to Taiwan. It would be so difficult to resupply, get in equipment. And so that's what the U.S. is dealing with right now, how to pre-position the kind of stocks in Taiwan that cannot be used for an offensive in any way, but send the signals of deterrence that Andy talked about, that any Chinese move on Taiwan would prove too costly. How do you put those defensive systems there in a non-provocative way because there's no Poland next door to rush stuff in?
Do you think China's emboldened by U.S.'s focus on Ukraine?
I don't.
Okay.
I think it's wary, and I think for the reasons that Tom said. Just a sentence or two. Combined arms operations. That is, ground forces, air forces, naval forces, cyber forces, all under connected and operating in unison is very, very difficult. They're watching what's happening as the Russian army is failing in this operation, and I think it's cast some doubt about whether they want to embark on an adventure themselves. I don't think they feel particularly emboldened. I will say this, though. I mentioned to Tom on the ride here, I was meeting with the Vice Minister of Defense from Taiwan this morning for several hours.
I love this guy. Yeah, this morning I was hanging out with Chinese vice president.
The provocations are constant. They're constant. After Speaker Pelosi visited Taiwan, that we read about it in the papers, but it's been continuous. I mean, the probing, the prodding, and so forth. This is intimidation. It's really about intimidation. And after the Taiwan president met with Speaker McCarthy in Los Angeles, it happened again. Not with the same intensity. It was more measured. But the provocations are constant. And that's why, when I talk about the real prospect of failure, having the ability to forestall an attack on Taiwan in which the leadership in China would say, we're just not sure we can do it. That's the position that we want to be. And in the same breath, we don't want to be encouraging Taiwan to take provocative actions either. So whenever there's a meeting with Taiwan, there's always a reminder that you have obligations to keep things under control, just as we believe that mainland China has the same.
You mentioned that in the 1990s, the biggest mistake America made was intellectual property, that we allowed them. Have we got a handle on it today? Are they still getting, I think, our universities, and have we limited their access to intellectual property is my question.
Better, but we don't have a complete handle on it. And I think this is something that, we see. This is one, by the way, I think I will say there is continuity in policy across administrations. I think that runs from the George Bush administration to Obama, to Trump, to Biden. I think we are getting a handle on it, but it's not under control yet.
I've been trying to think about how to put this in this form of a question, but I think the question that's really coming to me is I'm not hearing a lot of talk about centralized versus decentralized. So you talk about Putin, what Putin's doing, and one of the things he's trying to do is set up more like a czar than like a republic. And China and the government there is trying to set up a centralized sort of power. And where I work in the business sphere, one of the things that is dominating is a decentralized structure. And those structures that are built around presenting this idea of like, you can't move, even if you have intelligence, unless I tell you you could move, is killing large organizations right now. And what's coming out, and that's something that we in the United States have the ability to move forward with. And so I'm kind of curious of what you see in sort of those patterns about decentralized versus centralized. And I think the last one I'll sort of toss on top of that is the story of David Marquet, which is more public, and where he talks about working with the USS Santa Fe, which was the worst submarine fleet in the entire fleet, and became the best submarine in the entire fleet through a process of using decentralized work. And so, I feel that that's a larger existential threat. And I'm curious of, do you see that battle between decentralized and centralized as a battleground?
First, at a systems level, I have a lot of optimism for the larger American system because of our ability to adjust and adapt when needed. It doesn't mean we're perfect at things, but in the way you described, using a more decentralized approach in which you can change, you don't have to necessarily wait for guidance from above across business activities and so forth, I think is a far more resilient system. We're going to see how well the system in China actually deals with challenges when they surface. The systemic challenge, I talked about China's debt earlier, it's coming. We don't know when it's coming, but it's coming. And we'll have to see how well a centrally controlled system deals with that challenge when it mounts. More generally, when we talked about this idea of eyes on, hands off, that's what you're talking about. Set the rules, have the boundaries, put guardrails around it. You have to have, real rules of how this system's going to operate, but then let it run. You don't have to control every decision. And we certainly know that we've been successful as a country. Businesses are successful when they do that, and we see it in the U.S. military as well. So this notion of a decentralized approach, I'm all for it. You just have to build the structures right and have the rules around it so it's performing in the way that you would expect. But no, you don't have to be in control of every decision. And as I said at the beginning, at the system level, we're going to have to see how this works for China. And we know how well it's not working for Russia right now. And that's, if you want to ascribe, a key element in terms of its very poor military performance in Ukraine, it's because it is centrally guided.
So after 9/11, I spent the next 15 years embedded with troops in Iraq and Afghanistan. And again, say what you will about the American military, the fact that it has empowered non-commissioned officers to be able to take over regardless. And early in the war in Ukraine, I think more generals of the Russian army were killed in the opening months than, I don't want to say died in all of World War II, but they were putting multi-star generals down commanding frontline units. The American military lets sergeants do that, and they're really, really good at it, right? And we should be proud of them because we empower them. Russia doesn't do that. China doesn't do that. And then just one final thought at the strategic level, we had a great interview with the former CIA director, former Defense Secretary Robert Gates, just a terrific public servant. He said one of the things he learned at the Pentagon was there are too many people who can say no and not enough people who can say yes. And one of his management techniques was to try to push down to the lower levels people who can say yes. And as Andy said, it's, you don't take eyes off, it's eyes on, hands off, but that will make the system more efficient. So your concern is shared by some of the most senior people in our government.
In the Cold War, Taiwan was a key part of our containment policy. It was an anchor. The Cold War is over now, I think. Yeah. But the question is, what's the importance of Taiwan to United States taxpayers today? Why do we feel such a need to defend it? it certainly doesn't appear it would be a springboard to other invasions, not even to Japan, who certainly would be justified to be invaded from their experience of the invasion of China by Japan in the Second World War. But a friend of mine thinks that the only reason we care about Taiwan is that it justifies keeping our military there. There's supposed to be a semiconductor company there, and those semiconductors could probably be made in Catonsville, and we're the biggest customers. Who needs who there? The semiconductor story probably doesn't answer it.
Yeah.
But anyway,
No.
what's so important about Taiwan?
Yeah, it's a
They're
fair
all Chinese.
it's a fair question, and I guarantee you're not going to like my answer. First of all, the American military is not in Taiwan. That's not what we do. We sail around it, we fly, we provide them. To me, the reason we care about Taiwan is not turf or power projection. I do not want to live in a world where bigger powers take over the territory of smaller powers against their will. That's why I'm all in favor of what the allies are doing in Ukraine. If all the voters in Taiwan said, you know what, we really like the communist system. You know what, we really like Xi. We want to be part of mainland China, then, as they say in Russian, пожалуйста. It's all yours. But Taiwan, at this point, does not want to be forcibly reintegrated with China, and that's why we have to stand up to aggression everywhere. And I'll give the last word to my partner and friend.
I'm not going to have a lot more to say. I mean, 40 years ago, we made a commitment to Taiwan, and it was under a one China policy that China and Taiwan would become a single country at whatever point they agreed. But we also made a commitment that that wouldn't happen by force. I think the word of, an American commitment to a partner is an American commitment. It's very important. I don't want to understate the importance of Taiwan's semiconductor either in terms of the advanced microprocessors that are made there. They are the most advanced microprocessors in the world. We could reproduce a capability. We could build a plant. That's going to take 5 to 7 years. If we don't have access to the microprocessors coming out of Taiwan, the American economy is going to take it will be severely, severely punished. If you think about how hard it was to get automobiles during the pandemic, think about not having the most advanced semiconductors that are the drivers of the American economy. So yes, we should be thinking seriously about what's the alternative to the advanced semiconductors coming from Taiwan semiconductor industries. We should have that plan B and plan C set up for that, but it isn't there today. So in the meantime, we have a dependence on, just as there are other critical technologies driving the global economy, there are probably fewer. I'm hard-pressed to think of any technology that's more critical than what's rather inconveniently 100 miles off mainland China's coast.
Thank you.
I want to thank you very much, Tom and Andy, for your presentation. The one thing I take away is just you talked about it in passing, about the need for a bipartisan foreign policy. It seems to me of all the lessons that we ought to learn from the past 20, 30 years, that is central, and I'm glad you mentioned it. I thank you very much for all the insights. So thank you very much on behalf of the audience.